Welcome to Amici, news and insight from the New York Judiciary and the Unified Court System. I'm John Carr. Today we have two guests, Frank and Nancy Woods, who are here to share an incredible story of how they went from being dinks, double income, no kids, to parents of 5. Frank is Senior Coordinator of Grants and Contracts with the Division of Professional and Court Services, and Nancy is Technical Manager with the Division of Technology. It all began about a dozen years ago. Nancy and Frank, both in their mid-40s at the time, decided to adopt a child. They ended up adopting 2, a little girl and a little boy, brother and sister who were in foster care. Then they encountered twin babies in the foster care system, and they decided to adopt them as well. Finally, they took in an older brother of their first adopted siblings. Frank, Nancy, welcome to the podcast. Why don't you start by telling me the basics? Who, what, when, where, why? I'm still a journalist at heart. How did all this get started, and how did it grow?
I guess I'll start. So my wife and I had talked about adopting for a number of years. In fact, we used to fight about it. And generally the argument went something like this, like she wanted an infant, and I would say, well, we're not getting any younger, maybe we should think about an older child. And then we would go back and forth and nothing would happen. So one day I had gone to a conference and heard a really terrific speaker who was talking about the needs of older children in the foster care system. And I went home and I was telling her about it, and I said, we really should think about this. And she said, she kind of finally gave in or gave up and said, if you don't do something about this tomorrow, don't ever bring it up again. So I went ahead and called a contact that I had at a friend of mine who worked in the field and picked her brain a little bit about how do you get started. And she said, where do you live? And I said, Rensselaer County. And she said, well, why don't you contact the Rensselaer County Department of Social Services and see when they're offering the MAP class, which is the class that you take.
MAP class?
Yeah, it's MAP.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember.
I think it's still called that, but
Is that an acronym?
It's an
It
acronym.
is, but I don't know what it stands for, and even people in social services don't necessarily know what it stands for anymore.
Yeah, it's something parenting program probably. But so ironically, they said, well, we're starting a class tomorrow. Can you guys come down? So literally like the day after.
So having put you in this position, either do it now or do it never.
Right.
But I didn't think we were going to start the class.
You didn't think of yourself the next day.
No,
So
I
the
never
very
thought
next
that.
day.
And I actually did research, it was I think a Tuesday.
Yeah.
A Monday or Tuesday, and we were both doing research at the same time. And I kind of had found an agency that I thought we would talk to, but then he said, I did you one better. The MAP class is starting tomorrow. And I said, okay, you win.
Mm-hmm.
We'll go to the training, which is a 10-week. At that time, it was a 10-week training, and that was in 2006.
10-week training. What do they do?
Yes.
Yeah, so you're learning about the needs of children, particularly children who are coming out of the foster care system. Mm-hmm. They do a bunch of exercises to, help ensure that you're going into this eyes wide open, that you've thought things through. Do you remember any of the details of what they did in that class? It was always very interesting, and it was also interesting to be in a class with other people who were also considering either becoming foster parents or adoptive parents.
Yeah, most of the people in this training were probably going to be providing foster care.
Did you consider that at all?
Not really. We had always thought that, based on a couple things, our age, our jobs, a lot of people who are wanting to provide foster care, in my experience, have their own children, and oftentimes the mom is a stay-at-home mom or maybe a part-time job. So this is a way for them, to sort of expand on that and provide foster care for people. She's already home and she's kind of, taking care of those things. And not all people, but a lot of people in my experience were doing more of that. We were very sort of committed or adamant about our interest was providing a permanent home, hopefully to older children who needed a permanent home. That was our interest. So we were always pretty honest and straightforward about that. But we also knew a couple things, like you had to sort of, you don't have to, but I think it was it's to people's advantage to take a little bit of a risk. So if you go through this sort of training and want to foster or adopt through the county, if you're sort of open-minded, right? There's this concurrent planning now, which I'm sure Frank will probably talk about a little bit later. So oftentimes the goal is going to be reunification with the birth mom. But at the same time, they want to plan for if that can't happen, are you or are there other people out there who are willing to provide a permanent home to the child? So if you're kind of open-minded about that, realizing that there is a risk, I think that placement can come relatively quickly, even if the child or children aren't yet freed for adoption.
So we were very fortunate that at the end of this 10 weeks, I think it was almost, like the last session or something, right around the last session, we sat down with the caseworker whose responsibility it is to find homes for kids who are in foster care. And she showed us some pictures of children. And one of the pictures, there was two, a brother and a sister, siblings. And, so my response to that was, but there's two. We had never talked about more than one. We had talked about adopting a child. And she said, I know, but I just thought I'd show you their picture. And of course, they were incredibly cute. And
you probably didn't want to separate them.
We definitely didn't want to separate them, and they didn't want to separate them.
They would really think long and hard, I think.
Before
the county
doing that?
I think so, yes.
I would
That
hope
seems
so.
to be right, don't you think?
Well, yes, but they had already separated Michael and Gail from their older brother Anthony.
That's true.
So Michael and Gail were in, 5th grade. Anthony was probably in, 8th or 9th grade at that point in time, and he was living in a separate foster home. But these two were freed for adoption. They were legally freed.
Let's back up. What does that mean, they're legally freed for adoption?
So their parents' parental rights had been terminated by the family court for different reasons. Dad had, mom had essentially abandoned the children and was no longer showing up for any of the court proceedings. Dad had been incarcerated and was a little bit less willing to surrender his parental rights. And it actually took a heart-to-heart with one of the county caseworkers who drove up to the facility where he was and, told him, listen, your children aren't getting any younger, right? Time is going on. You don't have any prospects of getting out for many years. These kids need a home. And that was when he agreed to voluntarily surrender. So I think the mother's rights, in this case, the mother's rights had been terminated through a court, proceeding, and the father voluntarily surrendered his parental rights.
Okay.
At which point the children become legally freed and can be adopted.
Okay. So at that point, Mike and Gail are, what'd you say, 5th graders?
They were.
And they're available. And then
They were.
What happens next? What's the next step?
So, when we saw 3 sets of pictures and we said, yes, we were interested in meeting Gail and Michael. So the caseworker set up a meeting. They were living with a foster parent at the time, and we met on a Friday after school. I can actually tell you the date, but it was after school about 3:30 in October. And that was the initial meeting. And it was really very interesting, It was exciting and scary and for all of us. And
Sure.
the kids were really adorable in person. They were playing on a trampoline. So they would kind of bounce in and out of the house when we were talking to the then foster mom. So that was kind of the first step in the process. And when everyone decided, children included, that we wanted to move forward with the next step, we planned a more private meeting where we were going to take them out.
Our first date.
He calls it our first date.
What sort of things did the kids ask you?
So
Are you going to make me go to bed at 8 o'clock?
This is good.
they were very different.
basically.
First of all, Gail was like immediately, without any thought, when do I get adopted?
Right.
What color's my room going to be?
Right.
I mean, she was so ready, without really giving it a lot of thought. And then Michael was the absolute opposite. He was so deliberative and so thoughtful about this, and he wasn't sure. And he had like a list of demands, basically. He was like, am I going to be able to stay up until 9 o'clock?
And he's a lawyer now?
Yeah, well, yeah. And can I have a lizard? Like a whole bunch of questions like that. And so we sort of fielded those questions. And, Michael, it took a little bit longer for Michael to decide that this was in his best interest, But that's what that dating phase is about, right? It's like, let's get to know one another. It's not only for us to decide if we want, to parent these children, but it's also for these children, they have some input into this decision. And so they have to say, I would like to come live with Frank and Nancy.
What would have happened if one of them desperately wanted to come and live with you and one of them was adamantly against that?
Geez, I have no idea. I imagine we would have probably met and talked it through.
Mm-hmm.
That would be my guess. Because they were young. They were 10 and 11 at the time. And if I had to guess, I think we probably would have.
You could have persuaded them.
I think so.
One more lizard. And
At that age, they have the right to be heard, and
Right.
you want to make sure that their opinions, that they have an opportunity to express their opinions, but ultimately what we all owe them is for all the adults to make a decision that's in their best
Correct.
interest. So I think the county we probably would have wanted to proceed. I think the county would have wanted to proceed, and then ultimately it would have been up to the court to finalize the adoption or not.
I think these were young kids, but they weren't infants. And I
Right.
imagine they would have formed some sort of bond with one or more sets of foster parents.
Yep.
Maybe biological, maybe not. How did that factor into everything?
So in this case, the foster parent, the foster mom, who they'd been living with for a couple of years at that point, had no interest in adopting them, right? So they needed to find a different placement for Michael and Gail.
So they knew they were going somewhere.
They knew
Yes.
they were going somewhere, and they always knew they were going somewhere, right?
And she would have had first, honestly, she would have had first, right? I
She
think
would have had the option to
the
adopt them.
option to
yeah.
adopt
Is
them,
that how
and
it
it never
works?
would have
Yeah.
gotten to
Foster
us.
parents.
Yeah.
if
Which is going
that's what
back,
she
but
wanted.
going back to what Nancy was saying earlier. For people who are interested in adopting through the county local departments of social services, that's often what happens. Is you start out by fostering a child with the openness to eventually adopting that child if they're not able to be reunified with their biological parents. And
It must be shattering for a kid who thinks he's going to be adopted and the foster family decides they don't want him.
well, usually
That
they
must
know
happen.
they know up front, right, whether it's an potential adoptive placement or not, right?
Right,
So
but
I
if
think
it's-
they do really try to be open in their communications with kids,
Right
right?
from the get-go.
Right. So the kids knew, well, Janet's taking care of us now, but eventually we're going to try to find adoptive
So
parents.
they went up to, Gail and Mike were not under any illusion that their placement was permanent.
Right. And honestly, during that time, I think, first of all, she was a professor and a single mom, providing foster care. And I do think that there was an attraction for them of coming into a family where there was a mom and a dad and, and this kind of thing. Sort of, I think that was something that they thought they would like as well. So the way it turned out, as you know, we did proceed, but for us it moved very quickly because we met them in October, honestly almost toward the middle of October, and we had our first overnight on Thanksgiving break in the house that was to become their home. We had them over the break, so they went to our family and stuff like that for Thanksgiving and stuff. And they ended up moving in permanently on December 22nd. It was a Friday in 2006. We picked them up at social services and brought them to our home. And, their stuff, they had some of their stuff, and we still had to
a
get
few days
ours.
before Christmas.
But so it was right. It was only clearly only a couple of days before Christmas. So for us, I don't think that's always but all kinds of different things can happen in an art. And one of the reasons, and I actually do agree with this, one of the reasons that I think that they came at that time was because it was a school break, right? So rather than wait 6 months or whatever for them to finish out a school year where they were, that was a good time, if there is such a thing, to move them during that break and then start the second half at the school that they were in and where we lived. So that was a very interesting thing. But as far as the their relationships went, and I agree with this as well, we were very open-minded about having them, helping them even, to continue the healthy relationships with biological connections. So they had a maternal grandfather that they saw from time to time. Certainly their brother, who Frank, indicated earlier, they had not been living in the same home. He was living with a foster father, and he was a teenager now, 15, I think, at that time. So we set up with the county. They were having monthly visits at social services. So we said, why don't Anthony and his foster dad, Ed at the time, why don't they come once a month to our house for Sunday dinner? So you know what I mean? We started to try to create something that was a little bit more normalized,
Well, basically a family.
Basically a family.
With stability, which they had never known, really.
That's right.
Ever, really, right?
And we had reached a point of stability. And, they were going to school, and we got them involved in sports, and we were living our lives. And
then you upset the apple cart.
Then the apple cart was upset. And
how did that happen? And then two more come into the picture.
That was a fateful day. So I guess the story, as I tell it, it may be fictional at this point, but I was in a meeting at work, and Nancy called me, and I said something to the effect of, like, I can't talk right now, honey, I'm in a meeting, and she's like, this is important, you need to step out, and then she said, well, the Department of Social Services called, and they wanted to know if we would take 9-month-old twins on an emergency basis as foster parents. They really don't have foster placements for these twins right now. Would you be willing? And I said, well, honey, whatever you think, it's fine, And she's like, no, you have to make an actual decision. And I thought about it for a minute, and I said, no, yeah, let's do it. And at that time, they said we would have them for 2 weeks.
Correct.
And 12 years later,
they'll be 11 in just a couple of weeks. Middle of December, they will be 11 years old, and they were 9 months old at the time. Yep. That happened to be September 21st, by the way. I know.
So this is a different dynamic. That they were babies. That they had no prior relationships that they would recall, I'm sure.
That they would recall, no.
Yeah. And they're brought into a family. So how did everybody react? How did Gail and Mike react to their new siblings? And like, I guess a baby just kind of grew up with them as siblings, right?
Well, yeah, Gail was just thrilled to death. She was so excited because Gail and I would play with baby dolls together. That's one of the things that we did together. Which, by the way, when I first got her, she said, don't ever get me a doll.
Really?
3 months later, she wanted dolls.
Why do you think that was?
I think that Gail became sort of, she was a tomboy, which is genuine, but also kind of toughened, and didn't want to open herself up to who she truly was, and to, caring for a baby is very, what's the word I'm looking for? It's nurturing. And it's, you have to trust and all these things, and I don't think she was ready for that. But by 3 months later, she wanted dolls, and we would play with these baby dolls together. So to Gail, these were like real life baby dolls. She was very excited. Michael, again, was quite the opposite. I think he thought this was going to infringe on, him and his interests, and he had sports, as you know now, and, all this kind of stuff. But it didn't take long. I mean, the babies came in, and as you said, they were babies, but it was very different because they really did have needs. And we had to rally as a family. They needed all the services, physical therapy, OT, occupational therapy, speech, and something else. I'm missing the fourth one. But so all these services were pushed in right away after they were evaluated.
Did you know at the outset how needy they were going to be?
No, I didn't. I had no idea what they were. Nothing at all. I remember thinking, oh my God, who are these babies? What are they going to look like? I knew nothing. They were small for their age, certainly, and they couldn't do things that a 9-month-old could do. Mm-hmm. They couldn't hold their bottles even at that time themselves. So initially we were treating them like newborn infants, feeding them like you would an infant and so on and so forth. But I do remember when the caseworker put them down in their little seats, I thought to myself, they were the most beautiful babies I'd ever seen in my whole entire life. I absolutely thought that. And I don't know, we rallied as a family. I mean, Michael was tentative. I mean, it is an adjustment.
Oh, sure.
But Frank rallied, and he would always have the bottles ready for me, and they needed different types of bottles for their needs. It's hard to explain, but one would throw up if she got the food too fast.
Uh-huh.
You know, and luckily I'm the oldest of 7. So I'd been around babies my whole entire life, children and babies, and caring for them. That's the only thing that got me through this experience was I knew what I needed on an emergency, what kind of diapers.
What was it, like a Wednesday night or when we got them? Or it was like amazing, right?
It was a Wednesday.
I had an office in a spare bedroom upstairs. By Friday afternoon, that office had been converted into a nursery. We had casseroles from all of our family and church friends and things of that nature. We had planned a progressive dinner where people go from one house to another, and we were the dessert phase, and this was scheduled for Friday night, and we went ahead with that plan, right? We pulled off our dessert. We were a bunch of people, and I would take people upstairs, 1 or 2 at a time to peek in and see the babies. It was hilarious. We just forged forward. I think I took maybe 1 or 2 days off from work. I think she did the same. By Monday, we were back at work, 9 to 5. Did our had miraculously found a very appropriate daycare setting for them.
Well, it was right in my tech
right
park.
at Rensselaer Technology Park, where the Division of Technology is. And so everything fell into place very miraculously for us. And
So you started this process thinking you'd adopt a child.
Right.
Now you've got 4. And
Right.
then comes Anthony. How did Anthony come back? Anthony, who is the older sibling of Gail and Michael, correct?
Right.
How did he come back into the picture?
There were 2 years between each of these. 2 years before the twins came, and then 2 years later Anthony came. You can start that off, but
yeah, so Anthony had been a part of our life, right? We had Anthony's Sunday dinners. We had Anthony's high school graduation party at our house. So Anthony was getting close to aging out of foster care. And I think it was during a drive we were driving to pick up Michael from his soccer practice, and Anthony was in the car with me, and we got talking, and he said something about, like, I don't know what I'm going to do when I leave foster care. And, I must have blurted out something like, why don't you come live with us? Mm-hmm. Obviously without having talked to her in advance. And Anthony was like, I thought you would never ask. So he really, had grown up to the point where he, sort of admired our family, probably regretted the decision that he had made years earlier where he had told the Department of Social Services caseworkers that he didn't want to be adopted. Anthony had always harbored this sort of fantasy that when his father got out of prison, they were going to get back together.
Did he know his father?
He did know Anthony, as the older one, had those memories.
Oh.
Yeah. And they had visited him sporadically.
I imagine to some extent with him it was a loyalty issue.
Yes, all of those things. He had a strong, family sort of sense of being the one responsible to keep the family together no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
And he wasn't.
I'm sure he saw that as his role, his job, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Yeah, again, he's like 5 years older than Michael. Over 4 years, anyway.
Yeah. So he came and, he lived with us, and there was some, like typical sort of young adolescent, emerging adults issues that we encountered. And, he didn't stay with us. He packed his hefty bag one day and decided he wanted to move out and be independent and live on his own. And a couple more years went by, right? And
approximately 2. Yeah, so he stayed for about 18 months.
We didn't see him that much during that 18-month
At first,
period.
not at all, and then slowly he started integrating back into like visits or, right?
Yeah.
A little bit.
Yeah. And then he really hit bottom, right? His car had broken down, and I don't think things were going well for him at work, and he was living with some roommates who, unhealthy things were going on over there. And so at some point he sort of begged his way back into our house, and this time we said we'll do it, but we're gonna have some more structure,
And goals.
Yeah, I think we put him on like more or less like this is a last chance boot camp kind of program, right? You have to toe the line here, and we're gonna have some goals, and the good news is that he achieved most of those goals, right? He's got a much better job now. He just got a promotion not too long ago. We helped him to buy a car. Establish credit, develop a bank account, give him some stability in life. And I think more importantly, what we've given him is a place to be every holiday. He came with us to Thanksgiving this year. He's there with us just about every holiday. He's just like what you would expect. What do you expect from a family when you're an adult, right? He has that lifelong family now. And so that's been really important to Anthony.
You mentioned holidays. What is the family dynamic? Are there different camps, or do they all get along well, or what?
Oh, we're one family. So yeah, they really are, or we really are one family. So Gail and Mike were only there for 2 years when the babies came, and so they saw them grow up, and now they're going to be 11. Anthony, having lived with us for 5 years total, right, on and off, they're sisters and brothers, almost like anybody. I'm going to say almost like anybody you've seen, and then I'm going to say maybe even more so.
Why more so?
Well, I think that for Gail and Michael and Anthony, having lived in a family that hadn't any structure or they hadn't developed that trust, or being able to count on family members, I think that they value it more than people that just naturally got married and had children. This is just normal. Mm-hmm. They've seen the other side, is what I'm saying. And for Anthony...
Sure, my kids don't know any other side.
They don't know any other side. They didn't... Listen, these kids went hungry, including the babies. They know, they may not have, as you said, memory, but they are affected. There are trust issues because there was somebody that they were taken away from.
And in their mind, can this happen again?
Right, even if it's pre-language, mm-hmm. There's still things. I'm going to tell you a story. You're going to like it. Amara is one of the twins. She was less than 3 years old. And she said to me, and Amara was she was always very close or around Frank. Cadence, the other twin, was always with me. Cadence was very needy as a baby, and it kind of demanded a lot of my time. And one day Amara says, as I'm putting them to bed, she said, "Mommy." I said, "Yes." And she said, "Do you remember when I pretended I didn't like you?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Well, I did." And that's prior to 3 years old. So, do you see what I'm saying? It's like...
Sure, she was afraid to open
That's right.
herself up
and
to
she
that.
was even aware of it.
That's remarkable that she was aware of it.
Yes.
Right,
so when people say, oh, they're babies, there's going to be no... Yeah, there is, though. There is something. And even them, we tried to make they knew the word adoption as any other word, right? As they were learning to talk and listen, because we wanted it to be... Again, normalized. This is our family. Everybody in our family is adopted. You know what I mean? And they even appreciate it. I actually have a thank you note in my pocketbook that Amara gave me around Thanksgiving, thanking us for driving 2.5 hours to see my family and her cousins, and thanking us for adopting her and for feeding them. And for toys and everything.
Very appreciative.
Very appreciative, yeah. And I think that Gail and Michael on some level may feel the same way.
Yeah. Now, Frank, you do a lot of work with the Child Welfare Improvement Project, which raises an obvious chicken and an egg question of which came first. Your interest in promoting permanency and better outcomes, or the adoptions? Or it kind of happened all at the same time?
It's interesting. I think that there clearly is a connection to the work that I was doing and our decision to adopt through the public child welfare system, right? I mean, people have other options, right? There's private adoptions, and you can go through, private adoption agencies. And, because of my experience of working with the family courts, I think we made a very conscious decision to go through the public foster care system because of the tremendous need and all the negative stereotypes that are out there. I mean, we used to joke about, very well-meaning people in our church community or other friends that we would talk with about our plan to possibly adopt children from foster care. And everyone would sort of look at you kind of funny and say things like, well, those kids come with a lot of baggage, And I, would chuckle and, basically acknowledge the fact that I come with a lot of baggage as well, right? I was adopted when I was an infant.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So, that was part of my thinking as well here. And I think we had gotten to a point where, we had some things in our life. We had time in our life. We were living well and, felt a certain something missing. And so that was part of the drive, I think, for us to bring children into our home. It was to share the sort of gratitude that we had of, everything that we had accomplished and, obtained in life. So,
what was your adoptive experience?
So I was adopted at 9 days old. So I have, little or no actual recollection of anything other than my parents being my parents. But I also, to their credit, I always knew that I was adopted. For as long as since I became, my earliest memories are
Just
knowing.
a fact, not a big deal.
Right.
They just they totally normalized it for me. So it was it's certainly a part of my life. It's a fact of my life, but it hasn't really been that big a deal. It's not like I'm like on some search to find my biological parents. In fact, I sort of made up a story in my own head about like how this must have come to be, and I'm sticking with that. So that sort of definitely, was probably one of the things that led us to at least start talking about adoption, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Nancy, with what you know now, what is your view of the foster care system and how could it be better? It's a tough system.
It was, I would have thought with Michael and Gail being freed for adoption, I thought this was going to be a walk in the park. And even that was very, very difficult to navigate. When we navigated it the first time, there were times I wanted to give up. So we had to keep our eye on the outcome and persevere.
Let me back up. So was it unnecessary bureaucracy or extreme due diligence?
In our case,
or
it was
both?
conflict between us and the foster mom. She did not make it easy for us. And we don't really know what the motives were, but clearly she
particularly
wanted.
because, as you said, she had no intention of adopting.
She had no
No.
intention of adopting, but she did have intentions to keep them longer. I'm going to be very frank. I think she wanted to continue to have the income through the rest of the school year, and that was her plan. And then when it became clear that we and perhaps the county were thinking that the kids should move in with us sooner, she didn't like that idea, and so then she started like bad mouthing us to the caseworkers and things of that nature,
yeah.
making it very uncomfortable when we would go there to pick them up or drop them off. She kept me waiting. We were supposed to meet to pick them up for that Thanksgiving weekend at a parking lot halfway between Berlin, where they were living, and our house in East Greenbush. And she kept me waiting there like 45 minutes to an hour. She was that, and I didn't give up. I wasn't going to give up, and we were going to persevere, and we were going to push through this. But it was very emotionally taxing. With the twins, it was, similar to what we were talking about earlier, where they were not legally freed. They were in foster care. The goal was reunification with their mom. We had made efforts to help their mom.
A little bit, yeah.
She had come to our house a few times. We figured, like, if they're going to go back with her, we should do everything we can to make sure that she's ready for that, right? Turned out she wasn't ready, and she wasn't going to be ready. She had a lot of issues. And she, frankly, made the right decision in the end. Her decision was to voluntarily surrender her parental rights with the condition that Frank and Nancy would adopt the babies.
So she would surrender her parental rights as long as you were the adoptive
Yes.
parents. Otherwise, no deal.
That was right.
Basically,
That-
yes.
Yep.
So yeah, I mean it's not an easy system to navigate at all. I don't know enough about the inner workings of it, why that is. some of the points of the training, though, the MAP training, I thought were very, very good, as we were talking about earlier. Things like working in partnership with any of the institutions and appropriate biological family members, I think was probably something I might not have known. Mm-hmm. And so I worked a lot with any school. Oh, they knew who I was. I called team meetings because I didn't want Gail and Michael to fall through the cracks. Things like that. I said, don't cut them slack. I said, give them let them do as much as anybody else does, because when they're done, they're going to be done, and the world is still the world, and nobody's going to care where they came from. They have to be ready. So things of that nature, we were very involved. But I think two things about the Department of Social Services or whatever. One thing is, I think they should talk more about addiction as being a factor, because I think that in my experience, many of the children that are in foster care are there because in one way or another, addiction is part of the family. The mom, the dad, whatever. They really shied away from that and talked a lot more about, if dad had hurt himself and they suddenly have to go into foster care, all these different scenarios. But what I'm seeing is addiction is really so often a part of it. I wish they would talk more about that, and we talk to our children about that so that they know what the risk factors is for them to become, to have to deal with that. Whether they pick up and use and become addicts themselves, or at least understanding that you are affected by this disease, mm-hmm. and that there are ways to deal with that as well. And so, as young as we can, we kind of talk about that in an age-appropriate way. So there's the addiction, and the other thing I would like to see different, because there are lots of children in foster care. For how long, you don't know, right? Back and forth or whatever. I'd like to see something be done to help more kids get involved in sports and the like, because it's been my experience, only mine, that doesn't necessarily happen. You're in a public school, and lots of times, for a year or 18 months or whatever, that's kind of a thing that helps kids to to connect with other kids, to try to find, become friends with kids that are more active in healthy ways.
That's true. So when a child is removed from their home, they're not just losing their parents, they're often losing their friends, their connections to all of their after-school activities, mm-hmm. their teachers. It's a very disruptive event in a child's life. And I've actually seen a lot of improvements in the system between the time that we were involved and now. Much more emphasis on locating and placing kids with relatives, right? So the department will go out and find aunts and uncles and things like that, people who could...
They'll actually go looking for them.
They do, yeah, yeah. There is more emphasis on the child's well-being and educational stability, and a lot of work has been done in that area. A lot more work to be done. I mean, generally speaking, it's an under-resourced system. Not only the child welfare system, but the family court system is. We dealing with the family court is like the legal equivalent of the emergency room. And you hear that quote mm-hmm. a lot of times, but it's so true, right? I mean, these are families that are in great distress. One of the things that I'm most excited about recently is that there's an emphasis and a movement really nationally to put more focus and emphasis on prevention. And so when families who are beginning to show signs that could lead to the kind of an event that would result in the removal of a child from the parents, why don't we wrap around those families earlier and figure out ways to help support them and keep them together in the first instance? Because, Michael and Gail and Cadence and Amara and Anthony are very fortunate. We're very fortunate to have them, but they're very fortunate to have us too. And not every kid who winds up in foster care ends up in a good permanent placement, right? The system tries, but it doesn't happen for every kid. And so the negative impact of removing that child from their parents in the first instance is if there's some way for us to get substance abuse treatment or
Right.
financial assistance or housing assistance
Or
or what.
training even, like, nutrition and shopping,
Right.
right? Shopping for food and meal planning and time
To
management.
me, that would be money well spent. Like, let's try to figure out a way to. I mean, there's always going to be situations where children need to be removed and put into foster care. I mean, there's serious abuse cases, but the vast majority of cases that come into the system are neglect. And what's causing parents to neglect their children? Well, there's life circumstances, immaturity, substance abuse,
Mental health issues,
mental health
serious
issues.
mental health
I mean, these
issues,
are all
yeah.
things that we should at least be trying to ameliorate before we take the drastic action of breaking up a family. And that's, from somebody who was the beneficiary of, families that, that where, the children, it was in their best interest in the case of my children. But I think that that's happening more frequently than it needs to, and that the system needs to shift to a more preventive model.
And what brings us here today is I happen to see a video, a part of a video, I guess, of OCFS, Office of Children and Family Services video that you two were in. How did that come about? What was that for?
You better. Well, I know that we got an email, right? You got an email from OCFS.
So I think it was
National
OCFS this year, for National Adoption Month.
Adoption.
What they decided they wanted to do was to highlight families that they also had some professional connection to. Right, so one of the things we learned, we in addition to them coming out to our home and tape videoing our family in our natural habitat, they also had a recognition day where we came and we watched the resulting video and they gave us a proclamation or something. And what we learned that day was they read off a long list of OCFS employees who've adopted kids from foster care. So many people who end up working in this field are touched by the kids. Like, once you meet some of these kids, all that stereotype that we talked about just goes away. These are kids. They're great kids, right? And yeah, they come with some baggage, but so what? Don't we all? Right? And so that was really neat. So it was really an honor to be recognized by my colleagues at OCFS. These are the people who are giving me this award, and Nancy and I, this award, are people that I work with all the time as we try to work together to improve the way that the system responds to these kids.
Great. Just one final question. You've obviously brought a lot of love and stability to the lives of 5 children. What have they brought to your life?
I have to color my hair very, very often now. I would say purpose and meaning. I would say that, Frank and I were in a really great place just before we made this decision. I mean, we were really, people go through ups and downs, but we were very solid at that time, and we probably could have taken any vacation or gone out to eat whenever we wanted and this and that. And by that time, as he said, we'd gone back and forth for over a decade on this, but we moved a lot too, during that time for careers and all kinds of things. So it really is the most important thing I or we will ever do. I make a lot of mistakes. I make them every single day. I'm not the person I would like to be all the time. But I think in general, I'm innately structured. And I wouldn't underestimate the value of that, of the dinners, and certain things, and homework, and all these different things, But we had our period where we would do this, that, and the other thing. Most of what we do is really centered around them now. And it's okay. Naturally, we still have to take care of ourselves or go out now and then, but it's not all that often. And this is what we do. And I feel like if all of them, hopefully, are able to go out in the world and be successful, and I don't mean financially necessarily, be happy in what they're doing, have successful relationships, friendships, and partnerships, those things, because those are challenges for people who have gone through these kinds of losses, I think, and trauma. If they can do that, I will know that I've contributed enormously.
Terrific.
That's how I feel.
It's-
So I have tremendous pride in them, and the percentage of kids who are in the foster care system that actually graduate college is incredibly low. I think it's like 5%. And I am working on 2 right now. My son Michael is going to graduate from the College of Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security, and Cybersecurity at the University at Albany this December, or so he tells me. He is a second lieutenant in the Army National Guard. He's an incredible athlete and just an all-around really good guy. My daughter Gail has 1 more year at SUNY Maritime College, where when she graduates from there, she will commission as an ensign in the United States Naval Reserve and obtain the third mate deck license from the Coast Guard licensing, which will enable her to be an officer on a commercial vessel of unlimited tonnage and unlimited horsepower. So I always have this vision of her like driving one of those giant oil tankers that you see out there in the ocean. She
And
will
leaving in your
literally.
driveway or
She
something,
won't be
right?
Yeah.
driving right away.
Right.
She might have to work up.
The third mate does stand watch.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they stand watch.
See, you know more than I do.
So yes, in fact, she would be driving the thing, and that's pretty amazing. And we just had parent-teacher conferences with the twins with their 5th grade teachers, and aside from the fact that they're doing well academically, I was thrilled to hear that their conduct is exemplary. And what more could you ask, right? And so they're doing great. Anthony is doing great. He's an assistant manager now at Panera, making a living wage finally. Really
In his own place.
living in his own place
For a year
with
now.
his own car. I mean, he's stable and he's doing well, and he's going to be a good, productive member of society. And so, yeah, we've done okay with all of them. There's more to come. This is a lifelong commitment, that we've made to them. So,
Well, Nancy, Frank, thanks for coming on the podcast. That was a lot of fun and very, very interesting.
yeah, thank you for doing
Thank
it,
you.
John. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Amici. You find all of our recent podcasts on the court system's website at www.nycourts.gov, and most are also in the iTunes podcast library. If you have a suggestion for an Amici podcast, please let me know. I'm John Carr, and I can be reached at 518-453-8669 or jcaher@nycourts.gov. In the meantime, stay tuned.